right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Okay? And usually we kind of approach that in terms of the idea of the 5 precepts, but also as part of that is recognizing that cultivating your giving nature is a big part of what happens when you're practicing right actions, because even as I mentioned, taking the precepts is giving someone freedom from you doing those things to them, but also supporting your community, being a part of that. I mean, if you think about compassion as an active thing, you can have compassionate speech, which means, number one, you don't badmouth somebody, or you don't speak harshly to them or whatever, don't gossip about them and that kind of stuff, but also say something nice to people, right? And speech takes a lot of forms, body language too. Smiling at somebody is an act of compassion, and it's a generous thing. So if you look at that segment of the Eightfold Path in terms of acting compassionately, then there's 2 things: refraining from causing harm and giving help. So it's kind of like what we were talking about with meditation, cultivating metta versus doing tonglen or something, cultivating compassion. On the one hand, you're giving a wish that you be happy. On the other, you're kind of taking in somebody's suffering. So it's kind of a 2-part process in the same way. On the one hand, you're refraining from causing harm. On the other, you're giving the benefit of your restraint, and also perhaps contributing to a charity or contributing to your spiritual community or whatever. If you look at some of the stories of the Buddhas, when he encountered people who asked him, what is it you teach? If it was someone who was fairly fresh to the spiritual life altogether, not someone who was an ascetic who had already been practicing and just kind of needed that little bump to get him over the line, but somebody who was coming in and saying, okay, I'm dealing with some stress, and where do I start? The first thing he would teach is dana, generosity, because you've got to be willing to share in order to make any spiritual progress. You've got to be willing to see that you're in a world with other people, and otherwise your efforts to cultivate a spiritual life are going to go in kind of weird, non-helpful directions. And then the second thing he would teach is moral restraint or ethical restraint. But I see those 2 things, and he talks repeatedly in other teachings about those 2 things being very closely related. Taking the precepts, refraining from harm is an act of generosity, just like giving help would be. Okay, morality. The root of the word morality is more, M-O-R-E. It's basically sort of rules of society. So society decides what's moral, sometimes with the help of God or a sacred document of some form that says this is what we say is moral. Okay. Ethical is a little bit less than that. I mean, they're very closely related, but it's more more personal, more kind of individual. So Buddhist ethics are based on the idea of non-harming. It's kind of a golden rule thing. I mean, you can reduce it to that. I don't want to be killed, so obviously I shouldn't kill you. I don't want you taking my stuff, so I shouldn't take your stuff, right? I know what's harmful because I know what I wouldn't want done to me. So that makes it more a more individual decision, and it puts us in a position of responsibility for what we do. We're not just going to follow guidelines set out by somebody else. We're going to have to think about what we do. So then taking the precepts becomes kind of a mindfulness practice. Then you look at them and you go, okay, not to kill other beings. Well, let me see if I can go out and actually do that. So, you drive a car, you probably kill other beings in the process. And to what extreme do I want to worry about this? The Jains, the Buddhist day, would go to very extreme lengths to not hurt even an insect and stuff, and some of them still do. They sweep the ground in front of them when they walk, and when you talk to one, they cover their mouth like this, which makes them kind of hard to hear, but they're trying to make sure they don't accidentally inhale a bug and kill them. The food has to be very carefully prepared, things like that. So we don't say, well, you can't kill anything. We say, okay, I'm going to set my mind on not killing. When you look at the way the precepts are worded in a very traditional form, it's, the first one, panati pata veramani sika padang samadhi yami. Okay. Basically, I vow to set my mind on, that's the samadhi part, samadhi yami, not killing, essentially. So it's not, okay, I vow I'm never going to kill anything. It's, I'm going to concentrate on not killing. Now we see that the mind has become engaged in this idea of harming or not harming. We're not obeying a law, we're having to think about what we do. And so it's the same thing with things like not taking what isn't freely given. What does that mean? Not engaging in harmful sex. There's no, oh, you can't do this one, and you can't do that one either. It's just, let me think about what I'm doing, the relationships that I'm getting into, and, and what might cause harm in those relationships. So, so that, in a moral sense, someone says, you can't do anything on column B. Those are forbidden. In an ethical sense, you go, okay, here's my objective, not cause harm. Now how do I act? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one of the things that appealed to me about Buddhism when I discovered it as a teenager was I realized that there's nobody saying, thou shalt not do this. Somebody's saying, well, you want to get free? Don't do that. And then you got to figure out what that really means too. And there's you can't, perfection then becomes a verb. I'm trying to perfect my behavior. I'm not trying to behave perfectly. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh who had a really interesting kind of metaphor for the following the precepts. He said, if I want to go north, I find the North Star and I go toward that. Doesn't mean I want to go to the North Star, it just means I want to go in that direction. And I think that's kind of a good way of looking at the precepts too. I can't absolutely not ever kill. As long as I'm eating, something's going to die, But I can try to live in a way that at least reduces the harm that I cause to other beings. And that's, and that's that's a good question. Eating meat and ethics. There are Buddhist traditions that are vegetarian. There are Buddhist traditions that are not vegetarian. The Buddha was asked by his cousin. He had an evil cousin, Devadatta, who said, I think we should make the monks not eat meat. We should be vegetarian. The Buddha thought about it, and he said, no, we need to be easy to maintain, because they were relying on others for their food, alms from supporters. And they didn't want to say, oh, well, you can't give us anything that ever had a face. We'll take what we're given. What he did say, though, is that you can't eat meat that was killed for you. So that would eliminate the incentive for people to, slaughter a goat so that when the monks came over and that sort of thing. You have to live realistically, and that was another part of this. If you were a Tibetan monk and you didn't eat meat, you'd probably go hungry a lot because there's not much else to eat. I have read in a few places that there is a sutra somewhere where the Buddha said that laypersons, householders, if there's other food available and abundant, shouldn't eat meat. I've never seen this scripture. But, I think generally you should be mindful of your food. I think I mentioned in the first of these talks, when the Buddha was a boy, he was taken to see the plowing ceremony, where his father walked behind the plow and ceremonially broke ground at the beginning of the planting season. And noticed as that was happening, all these insects and worms were exposed, and birds flew down and ate them. And this was for growing rice, probably. If you're eating, something's dying. Doesn't matter whether you're eating meat or not. Other beings are killed in the process of you sustaining your life. So, when he talked about right livelihood, one of the wrong livelihoods was raising animals for slaughter. I don't think you could do that and it not affect your mind somehow. I don't know. But then it's kind of a personal decision. When I go to Publix and buy a steak, am I supporting the killing of beef, of cattle? I think you just have to make that decision yourself based on how you feel about it. I think some people need to eat meat to maintain health, and that they should. Other people maybe not so much.